Hey everyone, and welcome back to YellowCard TCG. Toku and Zistro back together once again to bring you some more matchup dissected. Title no longer pending, I think we'll rock with it. This time around, we're featuring Bastion and Orfist. Why Bastion? Because it's been the same deck for 20 sets. Why Orfist? Because it had a good showing at Worlds. So what's your initial takes on this matchup so far, Ben?
My initial take is that the reason we're doing these decks is because they are the decks that we own.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be a lot of the major things that happens in matchup dissected is most of us will just be playing whatever we own at the moment. I've been an overdressed Andy basically since set 1, so things like Nirvana and things like Bastion is all I've really cared about and cared to upgrade. I did manage to pick up Chronojet recently, so I'll have another deck under my belt for the overdressed format, but these happen to be the best investments of my life. Bastion was a deck that I never had to upgrade for, like I said, 20 sets, so because of that, I've been saving a lot of money that I can now use to actually get swirlers and the effect draw triggers for my Chronojet deck.
I'm slightly of the opposite opinion, but we're not here to talk about that. We are here to, as the title suggests, dissect this matchup. Looking at these decks, they are both, I think, what can be categorized, or as close to as categorized as possible to aggro decks as far as overdress goes. Standard isn't really a format where you can say, this deck is aggro, this deck is control, because of how, not dumbed down the game is, but how much simpler the game has become, or rather how much stronger effects have become, thus taking away, not taking away, but there's less focus on fundamentals and gameplay style and more just whose cards do more things.
Yeah.
And what's particularly worth mentioning is that even though both decks have very quote-unquote low shield values because Bastion's full of grade 3s and Orfist never has any goddamn cards in its hand, it's a matchup where it's not about who can deal more damage faster, but who can survive the other person's offensive.
I think that's a really good way to put it. And you'll also notice that in the early stages of the game, every chance that I had that I was able to guard, every trigger that I got in the early game, I would be using to guard because at this stage of the point, similarly to NV Premium, the narrative that I like to really talk about is that it's easiest to guard when it's easiest to guard, so take the damage when you have to and don't when you don't have to, because when the time comes and Orfist is going to be swinging with its 60k columns, that's when I want to be saying no guard, not in the early games when I can 5 to guard or like 10 to guard.
Yeah, and it's kind of the same for Orfist because, again, you'll end up with a lot of cards in... the time at which you have the most cards in hand, like I do right now, half my hand is 0 shield orders. And once I start comboing and start actually playing aggro, I will be calling stuff to the board, I will be discarding cards for Orfist to make tokens, and I won't actually have the shield value to guard like 40k Aldens and so on and so forth.
On the topic of Alden, Alden is probably the MVP of Bastion as the archetype, it having a Pot of Greed on leg skill, but mainly trying to kind of shield your opponent from attacking you in the early stages. Because your opponent knows that Alden exists, your opponent knows that sometimes they want that second counterblast, they actually won't attack into your Vanguard and they'll swing into the grade 3 rearguard that you popped off of the grade 2 superior call instead. And at that point, that grade 3 has then effectively became shield on board since you're generally going to have more grade 3s in hand to replace it anyways. So sometimes I do like to leave the grade 3 in the back so I am able to soak the damage to be able to play Alden the next turn, but in the format now where every other deck in the format is just faster and better at doing what Bastion can do, I tend to throw the grade 3 up in the front and try and have it act as a Shoodle shield.
Yeah, and what's also critical about Alden is that it digs for pieces that either are shield, like the dragon that gives your Vanguard 10 or 20k, or even just triggers, whereas Orfist doesn't have that range. Like, Orfist has very little digging or plussing, it is just put cards onto the board, and unlike with Bastion, where all of your pieces onto the board have other effects and provide additional value, Shadow tokens don't do any of that, they are just big guys.
They are literally just big guys. So a lot of the times when we talk about matchup dissected, we talk about plussing to hand, plussing to board. Orfist is probably the prime example of a deck that pluses to board. You get a lot of tokens onto the board and you are able to sit on them. However, when you do want to do your combo, you actually lose a lot of value as you call over your tokens, and then you're forced to discard to get the multi-attack out. So you lose value out of the tokens to make new tokens, so you're not really scaling up. Whereas because I'm drawing into grade 3s, drawing into triggers, drawing into shields, I'm slowly able to make like a higher quality hand, whereas your hand is basically based off what you drive check, what you draw.
Yeah, like you can see in this turn, I played down 2 Kagulas and Howling the Soul Blast 1 draw order. So I've made a board, but I haven't actually increased the raw number of cards in circulation at any point. It's the same number at every time. Whereas with Alden, it is literally just 2 more cards on the board, as opposed to just calling from hand or whatever. And then I make boosters and I make an attacker here, and it's costed me that 10k shield. And you'll see here that because you're on low damage, you need counterblast to use Aldens. You're going to end up taking a bunch of this instead of guarding, which means that I won't actually be able to convert that into damage to the board. Like, I'm not pulling shield value out of your hand, I'm barely pulling up a damage lead. And so even though I'm dealing 1 or 2 damage, I'm still overall falling behind.
Yeah, and then we can also see, like, from your drive check that you just got there, I think that was like a grade 2 or grade 3 and an order, which is effectively like 5k or less shield. And then with how high numbers get for Bastion, as defensively weak it is fairly strong offensively, I will give it that. Not finding a lot of shield, not finding the triggers on your drive checks will let the Bastion turns do a lot of damage here. So this is a card that I actually really like, and I'm surprised that not a lot of people play it, and that's Spirali. So a lot of the times, especially when you're on Bastion Prime, a lot of people don't know this. Alden actually says grade 3 units and not grade 3 or greater units. So you do need an extra grade 3 onto the board if you are on Bastion Prime. And sometimes, even if you don't have the Dark Strain for the boost, even though you don't have the Reflux for the extra 10k boost, or just to have something on the board, Spirali at least acts as a 5k shield, and that does help breach magic numbers. And it just helps push that extra damage you need to be able to kind of like break your opponent's hand while you build your own backup.
It also helps that it has an effect on the board that contributes to your game plan without losing anything. Again, compared to Kagula, I gave up 5k shield in hand for a 20k power body on the board, and in hindsight, that just wasn't a good deal, because that 5k shield would have come in really handy right about now. Highlight here is about Bastion is that you see that I burned the Sanctitude quite early on, and that's because, like I mentioned, these are aggro decks, so even though I'm on 5 damage, he only's on 3, I'm trying to end the game within the next turn or 2. So my thinking is that there's no point holding onto the Sanctitude for dear life, because I do need to use it, and as a result, the quicker I burn it, the quicker I get a turn immediately, and that turn immediately could be what I need to win the game.
So a lot of relief on my side of the thing, seeing the Overtrigger go into Soul there. So I know that I don't have a funny card to deal with in the upcoming turns. So this means that I can be more precise in my guarding. And I think that's a big thing playing Bastion, is that because you don't have extra 5ks in hand, you don't have extra 5ks because of the grade 1s and 2s, everything is based on your triggers, and sometimes the dragon that looks to be cut in the future as well. So knowing that my shield value is limited, I now know exactly what to expect and what the upper maximum is and what the lower minimum is that I can expect to see from Ben's side of the board.
Yeah, and again, that's really relevant because both decks don't have a lot of shield to play with, which means that every piece of shield counts a lot more than it normally would. So in this case, knowing that you can afford to use 10k instead of needing to PG a column definitely changes. It lets you play a lot more safely, and you don't have to worry about losing to something like that. And that's again kind of compared to Gravidia, or maybe to an extent Ava, which kind of not live by the overtriggers but are much more reliant towards it. The fact that Orfist is just the same lines with or without the overtrigger kind of doesn't make a difference.
And then as we were talking, Orfist, despite being that 5 attack deck that we talked about, those really high powered 5 attack decks, you are losing hand over a long stint of the game because you don't actually plus to hand. So we can see that at this point here, I do end up PGing the center column, but you are going to be on 2 cards left in hand at the end of this turn. You will get that heal trigger, which does help you, but if I'm able to get my 5 attacks off, then I don't think it is enough for you either.
Yeah, and that's kind of the critical problem here, is that my game plan requires a lot more committal than yours does, and I think that's what holds me back. And it's why I think Bastion is actually it's why I think Orfist is actually pretty heavily represented in the meta right now, because all the other popular decks, say Youth Burk, Ava, etc., they're all, even Chronojet to an extent, is they're trying to play the long games. They're trying to get to like turn 5, turn 6, and win through card advantage, you know, like death by 1,000 cuts, like, and just having like 5k more shield than your opponent does, which means that they kind of lose to this early heavy aggression that Orfist and both Bastion can put out.
And I actually think that's interesting, yeah, because Bastion right now is just an unpopular deck. A lot of people say like Bastion gives depression, and like I've definitely been on that side of things before. But when it's highs are highs and it's lows are lows. Like Alden is a very good card, and if you draw your triggers, if you get the shields that you need, like because of Alden, Bastion gets to go through its deck faster than many other decks do, and because of that, you get to see more of your triggers, you get to see more of your pieces, and so you're going to be able to be more consistent in like these kill turns that you look towards. Now, unfortunately for me, this turn where you were able to get heal crit, it crippled a lot of my offensive power, and I wasn't actually able to fulfill my board back to be able to get the Alden the power. I wasn't able to get another attacker on the side either. So you can see me kind of mold here about what to do. I also recognize that it's my final turn, so getting that extra 5k boost onto the center column there does make magic numbers. I'm going to die on the next turn anyway, so this extra 15k shield in hand does not do anything. Go ahead and call it down. Alden should be rested there. Then we're going to swing center column here.
Being on 4 damage, I'm still facing down 3 attacks. I have to guard where I can. And even if I guarded the Alden column, being unable to guard the Vanguard just means I will lose to crits no matter what. So you find the crit, you find the restand, and there's no way that I can get through that without another heal without 2 more heals off the top. But OT is out, everything's out, so there was just no way it was going to happen. Like, even though I was able to stop you from going full wombo combo, the fact that I wasn't able to actually win the game is what really holds the deck back, is that if your aggro doesn't work out, you will lose the game.
Yeah.
Like, similar story with Bastion when you're facing up against the likes of Ava or Youthberg, is that, sure, you have like this incredible turn 4 where you're throwing like 50, 55k columns at your opponent with 4 to 5 attacks. But then the moment you've done that, all you have left in your hand are like 2 to 3 triggers and then a bunch of grade 3s. So when Youthberg eventually, like, you know, restands their Vanguard with double twin drive, or Ava hits you with a crit Obskidad, you're going to have to take more of those attacks than, say, Ava into Youth or Jet into Ava.
And I think, that's a good way to put it. It's just that we do have our one fundamental turn, and if that fundamental turn is not enough to crack at the resources that are like the upcoming like meta decks are looking to be able to farm, then we just gave them the resources for them to kill us on the back. Because we're going for our kill turn, we're going to give them counterblast, that is a given. But then if we can't finish it on that turn, they now have all the tools, all the counterblasts to play with to just kill us on the swing back. I think it's just like one of the unfortunate things of power creep, or maybe lack of love, so to say. Because Bastion is a deck, like I said, has not changed in a while, and I'm not sure if it's the reason like, oh, we're afraid of what Alden can do. Alden is not really a big threat anymore. So lack of love on the side of Bastion. Yeah, we're getting some support, but as you can see, none of those new support cards since the last X sets have done anything for the deck. Meanwhile, all the new ride lines are getting like their promo orders, their promo cards that are helping them. And because of that, they're just getting like more and more text on their cards, which are more meaningful text than just plus 5k that we see on a lot of other cards.
Yep, so here, the reason I played all the Kagula the turn before is because I knew that I was going to be playing the second Overcoming in the turn Z from hand, so I needed the soul to be able to make tokens and play the order. And here, with the Nouveau Raya, I've still got 5 attacks on turn 3, but the issue here is you see that because Tony's ride line is a much heavier plus than mine, he does have the ability to guard some of these attacks that, you know, like I said, guard where you can, and I put forward a really good aggression, but it's not enough to, say, cripple his offense on, say, a turn 2. Crit comes down, but again, it's not really that much. He takes a bit of a damage loss, but it's easy for him to recoup that loss. The double defensive also means that the tokens no longer hit, and he's now ready to just start his turn and start going.
Yeah, so we'll see that I have 4 counterblasts, which is perfect for Alden into Alden. So a lot of times, this is what people are worried about when they are up against Bastion, is that if they give them too much counterblast and they are able to convert it into Aldens. One of the things about Bastion at the moment is its counter charge is heal triggers. So Alden is a heavy cost. 2 counterblasts is not cheap. So being able to counterblast 2, and yes, although the only counterblast in the deck right now is Alden, we do run more than 2 Aldens. So having access to being able to play more Aldens down via being able to heal, that's why sometimes, despite myself saying it is good to keep yourself at a damage advantage by guarding early, you also want to keep your heals live by almost staying at parity with your opponent. And by doing that, like sometimes you don't have to aggress, or sometimes you bait your opponent into guarding early, like make them guard the early attacks as well. That way you get early guards, they get early guards, and your Aldens and your heal triggers have a lot more value than theirs will.
Yeah, and in the same vein, again, in this particular matchup, neither of us really have that option of staying on low damage and guarding where we can, and you're trying to deny your opponent, because again, we're both trying to win the game as fast as we can. You're quote unquote like almost outrushing our opponent, dealing more damage than they can deal with in the early game, where other decks are weaker. And I think in matchups like, say, against Ava versus Bastion or Youthberg versus Orfist, these aggro decks have the advantage because they are able to get the opponent to like 3 or 4 damage early, where the opponent can't use that counterblast as effectively as, say, Orfist with double Combine Rusher or Bastion with double Alden.
And we see there that, like, despite ourselves both realizing that our best game plan is to try and outrush our opponent, losing that extra attack does not play very well, because losing that extra attack also means that I lost the ability to cycle out a grade 3 in hand for a potential shield that lets me survive this next upcoming turn off of this Brawler restand. Getting the 2 PGs does make me feel safe at least. You can also see that, like, my hand is pretty thick despite myself being Bastion. Yes, I did take 4 damage at turn 2, but I believe that with the damage that I was able to deny on the upcoming turn, because of the defensive and because of the lack of restand, I should be able to sneak away from this turn quite easily as well, and then thus convert the extra counterblast into more pluses if I found another Alden, or stay at that damage deficit where my heals are live and Ben's aren't.
It also doesn't help that, again, Orfist's inability to dig for cards and cycle through its pieces is really coming up here. The fact that I missed Persona Ride, I missed the ability to make extra tokens on my turn so that I, like, at this point, these tokens, are like, the first few swings I had were both for 15 and 13, not a lot. Whereas if I had, say, a Kagula or even like a make a token order, I would have been able to swing with you for 25 early on, meaning you would have been unable to guard those early attacks effectively.
So yeah, I drew my ult. I got the funny trigger. I did not die on 6. I did get the over trigger. I did no guard on the Vanguard swing. Surprisingly, I think we were in chat at this time and we were just memeing around, just like if I no guard, or if you crit I no guard, something like that. And because I did have the PGs, I did have the facilities to guard these attacks, but for some reason I chose not to, and I got rewarded with the over trigger. That's a misplay. Definitely should have guarded. Overtrigger did come to save my ass, and it does come to win me this game in the future, as you can see, despite Ben being able to like put on that like large aggression, the hand disparity is night and day. He's sitting on 5 cards in hand, I'm sitting on an entire book. Yes, my book might be filled with chapter 3s, but these 3s are going to do a lot of damage.
Yeah, and especially considering that we're almost matching each other for aggression. So me having less cards in hand, even though I'm on lower damage, I will eventually be forced into a point where I have to guard more cards. And of course, I do want to take some damage here because I need Counterblast to use my orders, I need Counterblast for Combine Rushes, I need Counterblast for Orfist himself. But knowing how big your hand is, and knowing that I don't have pieces because I drove check just triggers last turn, I don't have another Persona Ride, I don't have more token makers, even if I go to 4 or 5 here, I don't have the piece in hand to launch another comeback counteroffensive. So even if I survive, it's not like I can pressure you that hard going to the next turn.
Oh yeah, and just like I said, making sure that we stay at least at a damage even, that way my heals are alive. I find the grade 3, I find another Bastion. And because I found this Bastion, I'm able to do this very cool line here. I then use the effect crit to push itself into Soul, and then after I'll prime Bastion Prime skill, ditching the Bastion from hand to stand my board, and this lets me use Spirale to actually Soul Blast the 2 new soul that I have now because of the effect crit to draw a card, netting me an extra potential shield that I will need to live the next turn. So in matchup dynamics, both decks need Counterblast, both decks like kind of need to play aggressively. I think in any other matchup, do you think any of us would have like played more like conservatively damage denied, or do you think like it's just the nature of our decks to try and win before we lose?
I think if, say, I was playing Orfist, if I was playing Youthberg and you were playing Bastion, then I think I would definitely be trying to play a lot faster than I normally would. But at the same time, you would also be trying to play a lot slower than you normally would because of Bastion's inability to, say, control the pace of the game. So if I start running away with the tempo like Youthbuck and Ava often do because of how much shield they can add to hand, how much board control they have, then even though you have all these cards in your hand, they are providing much less value than the cards in my hand. And that's where you'd start falling behind, and then that's where I'd start generating a lead. But in this case, because we're both trying to win fast because that's what our deck does, it's almost like a race to the finish line.
Okay, yeah. So, like, in this matchup, we're both racing to the finish line. We're both trying to kill each other before we die. But let's say, like, when we play against a deck that just has, like, a stronger end game, we would probably take it more slow, try and pick at their resources, wait for, like, an opportunity moment to actually strike, convert our own counterblast to stronger pluses, and hopefully try and win the game from there. But yeah, as for this matchup, as is the title matchup Dissected, these are two decks that are very aggressive, generate low shield, and because of that, literally just racing to the finish line, trying to kill each other before we die to our own demise.
Yeah, like, that's not to say that you want to, wait till like turn 5, turn 6 against the likes of Youthbuck or Ava with these decks either. Again, these decks are trying to like push Youthbuck and Ava to like 5 damage by turn 3 because that's how you win the game, because that's where those decks are weaker. It's more of a case of Youthbuck and Ava are decks that have inevitability, right? Like, they will get to the finish line with or without you. And you need to play their game in order to like trail behind them and then find the right moment to like blaze past them. Whereas in this case, there is no waiting for the right moment. The right moment is straight away. That's the big difference to make here. Like, sure, we both had overtriggered in this game. I wasn't able to like hit my full combo pieces. You were. Big things like that are what decides matchups like these, compared to small things like where, oh, Youthbuck had Tempest and removed Alden from the board, or, oh, Ava searched for the grade 2 Obscudad and swung at all your front row, forcing you to remake a board. In those matchups, it's all about the small incremental advantages, whereas in these matchups, it's all about who saw this big fat wombo piece first.
So almost in a sense that this matchup, because of how fast we plan to go, is almost like a roguelike. We want to like play our hand as best as we can to try and make it as much, but like we also want to see our front-loaded cards, like our Aldens, our Persona rides, that would just like make a higher impact as soon as possible. And I think like you said, I saw my Aldens first, I saw my Spirales first, I got into my triple drive a lot sooner before you get into your Persona ride, and because of that, I'm able to garnish the, I wouldn't say advantage, but the more offensive momentum. And basically, despite the 6 damage overtrigger, I was able to take a lot of offensive momentum that we saw there and try and swing it into my favor.
Here, we've seen Orfist lose quite a few times now, and I don't think the matchup is unwinnable, but I think the only way Orfist is favored here is if you hit like early stumbling blocks, pretty much, because again, your ride line pretty much unbricks yourself. Like, your deck wants to be seeing grade 3s, so you don't get punished for it with your ride line. Whereas I need to see a combination of orders, token generators, bodies to swing with before I make tokens. And at some point, by like turn 4, turn 5, I want to see Persona rides. So here, I find Combine Rusher, which is an early aggro piece, which is nice. I can still put forward that aggro that you can't on turn 2. But then, unless I follow it up with, say, Overcoming an Eternity, Cagulas, Nuvareas, I can't capitalize on that. Whereas for you, every single grade 3, even if it's Alden, even if it's Refluke, like, by turn 3 or turn 4, as long as you can put bodies onto the board, you're playing your game.
Yeah. Not to mention that, like, throughout these past 3 games now, I've also been very fortunate on defensive triggers. I think within these last 2 games, in especially like the early game where I was getting rushed down, yes, I wasn't able to heal off face down damage to act as pseudo countercharge, but I was still able to heal, which then gives me that like damage buffer that I can no guard in the early game.
The important thing to know about this particular turn here is that you could actually just swing at Combine Rusher and damage deny me, because going first means that I will have the Regis line, which gives me damage to play with. So here I give the defensive actually to my Rearguard just to keep it alive, just because I know that I need bodies to attack with before I replace them with tokens with Nuvarea. And even though I have what's, quote unquote, a very good setup here in I have Overcoming, I have bodies, I think I do have a Nuvarea in hand this turn as well. The fact that I can't push and commit and build that lead, I think is what really holds me back from winning the game, basically.
Yeah. So, like, because I was able to get that early heal in the game, and then despite yourself putting out this, like, really scary board here, despite myself also having the option to damage deny your grade 3 turn here, I evaluated that, like you said, we're racing. Like, these are two decks that are racing based on our aggression. And I thought that it was more valuable for me to actually give you that extra damage when I could, at a point where it's easier for me to give damage, if that makes sense. Like, despite in the early game, it's easier to guard there, the early game is also the best time to give damage because most people will be inclined to take damage. And so, because of that, this makes my grade 3 turn scarier because I'll be able to go into 4 attacks, including Alden. And if I'm able to really cripple your hand on that turn, it'll then make my grade 4 turn even that much scarier, give you less damage buffer to play with. And at this point, when you have 3 face down, it's a lot harder for you to play with 3 face down than it is for 1 face down, because 1 face down means you have damage buffer to go up to 4 face up, 1 face down, whereas at 3 face down, an accidental double crit could just win the game for me.
Yeah, here I actually pass with swinging the big column just to deny you from the Alden, because at this point, I actually have a hand for once, and I'm trying to maintain that lead of, even though I'm behind on damage, I'm ahead on overall resources. So I'm trying to like keep that momentum going and force you to burn more and more pieces to the board, which hopefully I can then start whittling away with more attacks and more damage. So here, you're only going for 3 attacks maximum, and even though I'm quote-unquote inclined to keep my board alive, it gives you the chance to then damage deny me right back, knowing that your game plays without counterblast, but mine doesn't.
So yeah, I go for the very conservative play, like you said. I didn't want to give away too many of my pieces that I would need for the upcoming turn as Bastion Prime, so Spirale being able to recycle itself, I was okay of putting onto the board and trying also aggressing, forcing some cards out of Ben's hand here. And with that, I do give him a counterblast he can play with on the next Orfist turn here. Also gets a Persona right, so I am looking at a lot of scary numbers on the offensive turn, but like I said, staying at 1 damage gives me a lot of opportunities to say no card.
Yeah, and here I've got double Combine Rusher in the bin, but I don't have the damage to abuse it with. And even though you're finally grade 3, I have the Nuvarea, it's still not like amazing numbers that we would normally expect. So I'm still only barely ahead on overall resources, but I'm definitely behind on tempo, because even though I tried to conserve hand, you were then able to play the same game and be like, okay, you want to play it slow? I'll take it slow, play the same game, and now you could do it better because of Spirale, because of the fact that I'm much more reliant on things like Counterblast and finding specific pieces than you are.
So you're building up your board now, and everything's here going to be large. You do have the counterblast to be able to make the front row. But because you don't want to expend too much of your hand, it looks like you are being very conservative with the kind of board you want to make. Now, obviously, this makes sense because Orfist is a deck that does look to turn counterblast into pluses onto the board, so there's no large point to really make boosters onto the board for these pre-attacking columns, where you're going to be able to make them on the swing anyways.
Actually, the reason I don't make a board here is because I just literally didn't have the pieces for it. I didn't have Cagulas. I already played my order for the turn, and it wasn't the Counterblast 1 order because I don't have Counterblast. And again, this is what I mean when I say that Orfist is very piece reliant. It's, if you find the right pieces, you can definitely like build a lot of advantage, as evident by the fact that pretty much every game we've seen so far, I've been super ahead in turns 1 to 3, and then by the time we get to turn 4, I suddenly fall behind. And that's again because of how the deck works, in that it's basically the equivalent of throwing cards at your opponent's face and hoping that they stick, which works against the likes of Ava and Youthbird because they don't have time to recuperate like Bastion does, and they don't have the ability to just punish me for it. Whereas Bastion, sure, you give me all the damage, I can throw cards right back at your face, except more cards and harder, and that's what really holds me back.
I think that's a really interesting narrative. And then, do you think Bastion might have a place in the meta if something were to happen where they are able to start being able to farm pieces like Eva, like Youthberg is able to. Because like we do have like our big retaliation card in Alden, which is able to like turn all the aggression that we took in the early game to offensive pressure, but we don't have any way of doing like soft counter aggression where we're always going to be able to have like a good engine of being able to like just counter blast one plussing and being able to farm like that. Because like we said before, Overdress, though it is starting to get a bit more unique and a bit more complex, it is still the simpler format. And a lot of it does come down to what are the cards you flip off the top of your drive checks. And I think that also statement kind of rings true for this matchup here, where basically you saw me resolve 2 Aldens this turn, which means not only am I seeing 3 new cards off of my triple drive, I also saw 4 new cards off of my Alden draw 2s. And it's kind of the same narrative that we saw throughout all 3 games now, is that I probably got a chance to see more of my deck than you did. And because of that, I'm able to make stronger boards. Like you saw this turn, I was able to do like a combination of Reflux and Dark Strains based on what I saw off my Alden draws. And that really does like change the narrative of like how strong this turn would be compared to how strong it would have been if my Alden draws were mid-battle phase or maybe end of turn.
Yeah, and like, you know, again, looking at other matchups like Youthberg and Ava, those decks are never going to give you 2 damage to use Alden on turn 3. Like, that just doesn't happen. Whereas something like Orfist, because I have to give you that damage because that's how I win the game, I'm basically playing into your win con, and to an extent, you're playing into mine. Like, that's why these games are over as quickly as they are, because even though it's a race, the moment one of us pulls slightly ahead, you kind of like, you know, slingshot or like rubber band the person behind a little bit further ahead. The difference is that your slingshot your rubber band is stronger than mine, so you know, with the same like gap between us, if you're behind, you pull forward more than when I pull forward when I'm behind. And again, that's kind of like what we see, where by turn 4, turn 5, you have more cards in hand than I do, and I'm forced to take damage where you're not.
So yeah, we are going to see the Elementaria come out here, and we do find the 6 damage trigger onto your side of things, so that does buy you an extra turn, which is really good to see. It means that on this turn, you should have probably the best chance to crack a bat, because like I said, I just went for my alpha swing here. My alpha, my windmill slam, my alpha strike. I put everything to the board. You saw me even put the heal trigger down to the board, so I lost 15k shield with the attempt of trying to win that turn. This also means that I gave you that extra counter blast that you're able to then make the combat rusher to that extra 10k attacker. Remind me, does combat rusher become like a 20k or a 15k attacker? 20k. With the persona right, that equals to like 30k, which is trigger plus some extra cards. So that does make a large difference rather than just swinging with the token, which would have just been a 5k shield.
Yeah, so this would have been, yeah, so this is now the optimal situation where this was the one time where your rubber band did not send you far enough into the lead. So both of our overtriggers are on the bottom of the deck, and it just goes to show that in a matchup like this, where both of us are basically converting useful cards into less useful cards for the sake of tempo, the fact that each individual card generates you, or it generates me less tempo, but for you, like, instead of giving up shield for no shield, you're giving up shield for shield. It's these small advantages that puts you further ahead. Mm-hmm. And even though I think Bastion is more poorly placed into the quote-unquote meta, like Jet, Ava, and Chrono, and Youthberg, because you won't have that ability to just suddenly pull ahead, because those decks will always try and keep you close, but not too close. You don't have the room to like go for those big alpha strikes that you've constantly been doing throughout this video. Whereas for a deck like Orfist, you give me an inch, I take a mile. But if you give me a mile, I can't take 5 miles. And again, when you're doing aggro versus aggro, we're both giving each other everything we need by turn 2, turn 3, which again, you see here that by turn 3, I pull out everything I need. I'm putting use like 3 damage, 4 damage, defensive triggers notwithstanding, on a regular basis, and then I just peter out just a little bit and then can't convert.
Yeah, and I think that's that main term here, is that word conversion. The counter blast that I give you doesn't stick, if that makes sense. Because yeah, I can give you a counter blast and then that can turn into Combine Rusher, which technically would be 5k shield on board. but because of the Orfist combo line, you are forced to then play over that 5k intercept, which could have then garnished a lot of extra value, putting yourself back to the drop zones. You could call it out back on the next turn prior. But because you changed those front row 2ks into 0k shields via the shadow tokens, you then end up actually kind of losing in the shield trade, and it does depend on what you end up pulling off of your drive checks. Whereas on my side of things, I naturally am just drawing grade 3s in general, so throwing down 0 shield to draw 2 more shield doesn't make too much. If anything, it just means that I see more of my triggers, be it through drawing or be it through drive checks. And because of that, I'm able to see more of my triggers naturally, which then just makes my shield naturally stronger, if that makes sense. It's a weird discrepancy to say that despite Bastion being the deck that just has inherent less shield via having so many grade 3s, it sometimes will get to see more shields because of how much it draws through Aldens.
Yeah, no, I think that's a totally fair point to make, and I think that's part of why once you like leave the tier 1 meta of standard, it kind of becomes like this, not jumble, but almost free-for-all, where almost like a rock paper scissors meta where X beats Y and Y beats Z and Z beats X and so on and so forth. And it just comes down to, right now, tier 1 is all about late game grind, incremental advantage, and that's a field that Bastion fights very poorly in, but Orfist fights very well in. But then once you start dealing with, once you start thinking, why is that the case? Oh, because Bastion's all about like these big swings, these high tempo changes, whereas Orfist is all about small turning into big advantages. It kind of makes sense. So to then beat Bastion, you would need something like Eugene, Bruce, Gravidia, these tier 2 decks that just constantly break away your opponent's board and never give them that chance to come back up. Against like if I was playing Gravidia, for example, there would never be a huge damage lead or discrepancy, but there would always be a massive board discrepancy. Absolutely. And that's where you would fall behind and I would pull ahead. Yeah. Likewise, if I was still playing Orfist and you were playing something like, say, Hexa or even a lyrical deck, you'd see that we're both trying to go toe to toe, and the moment you fall slightly behind or you give me that 1 extra damage or you don't push me hard enough, I would then suddenly hit you with the 5 attack Combine Russia Nuvarea combo, and you would lose everything. And it's that sort of balance that I think it keeps standard interesting from a theory point of view, just maybe not so much from an actual execution / gameplay point of view.
And with that, I think that's going to conclude this episode of Matchup Dissected. So on the left, we had me, myself, Toku on Bastion, and on the right, we had Zistro Ben on Orfist. Honestly, probably the best way that we said it throughout the commentary was this was literally 2 decks racing to try and push each other into the mud at the finish line. It came out that basically sometimes it was the triggers that made a lot of the differences in these games, but also having the ability to just convert your counterblast better was a very telling tale on the Bastion side of things. Having that Alden into the Alden, into multiple Aldens, just to be able to draw a cycle, turn your hand better, put more power onto the board when you're going for the kill turn. And also despite myself being Rush in the early game, converted that back into Rush into your game. Your aggression wasn't as strong as mine, despite myself giving you the same amount of resources. And I think, just like you said, that's probably a very good narrative and dynamic that was shown here.
With that, thank you everyone for watching. As always, if you like the videos and want to see more like this, leave a like, drop a comment, tell us what you want to see next. As always, subscribe to the channel to keep up with what we're doing next. Again, we are primarily a Vanguard channel still, but we're trying to branch out, make loads of different content. So stay tuned with what we have coming up next. And as always, thank you for watching. Have a lovely day. Take care. Bye-bye.